Well, Venetian painting, a little bit of kind of weird Spanish painting, and Mannerism as it's known. We're just going to lump these all under Mannerism, though. So this is lecture guide number 4. Mannerism, 16th century Venetian and Spanish painting. And so I'll give you a quick, brief list of some of the things to be looking out for in these works of art. Some of the things that define Mannerism. Right? The top set of terms are the nicer ones. So general characteristics of Mannerism as a style, or what's known as la maniera. Charm, grace, playfulness. If you don't like manieras, many people at the time didn't, you would call these things superficial, ornate, and lacking of gravitas, meaning lacking of seriousness. 2, formal beauty for its own sake, by which we mean a beauty that might be composed out of lines and colors and shapes, but has very tenuous relationship to a kind of real human being or a real figure. Right? You'll recompose figures or extend them or distort them because it's visually pleasing, but if they were real human beings, it wouldn't look quite right. Artists are oftentimes very interested in showing off, doing something that's very difficult. So virtuosity, sophistication, elegance. And then for me, the big ones, frankly, over and over again, are ambiguity, manipulation, and distortion, particular of spatial systems and of human bodies. And remember, a style is just our entry point to these works of art. It's something that can help us to see, to focus us in, to say, oh yeah, this is different, but we really want to get to the stage where we say, what does that difference mean? What does it mean for the artist to do this? So why do we have a change in style, right? What happens? Well, we did a little bit of this work already when we were looking at Michelangelo's kind of mid-stage career, and we said the world changes. The world's a different place. You have the founding of the New World. Suddenly the world's not flat, it's an orb, apparently. In the middle of the century, Copernicus will go one step further in 1543 and say, hey, by the way, you're not even the center of the solar system. Right? What does that mean? If this world was made by God and we're somehow special, why aren't we the center of all things? And of course, that's what the church was threatened by, and they said, hey, Copernicus, take it back or we're excommunicating you. So he said, okay, I'll take it back. Right? So what else? We've got the Protestant Reformation. We've got the Anglican Church developing. We've got Charles V marching into Rome and conquering it. We've got the Council of Trent. We've got a world that's shifting. But the big thing that has an effect on this art style is the drawing up for a period of big public art commissions. So you don't have big projects like the Sistine Chapel. You don't have big public projects like the Stanza della Signatura or St. Peter's. You have a whole host of smaller projects in which the artist and the patron will work out ideas between them that don't necessarily have to be understandable to the wider public. Right? If you're just having a painting painted for you, you might put all kinds of weird esoteric things in there that are just about appealing to you because you don't care if anyone else knows about them. The other thing that you get in a lot of these works of art, though, is a kind of sophistication that goes along with that, a whole bunch of complexity that goes along with that doesn't need to be readily apparent to everyone. And finally, and this is a little bit of a red herring, generally speaking, after a while, styles start to get exhausted, right? Classicism had been around for a long time, and people want something else as well. Now, they don't want something else until something, again, big in the world changes or the context changes, but that's something to keep in mind too. So let's look at one of these. This is a Venetian painter. I'm just going to go through it quickly. This is a work by Verrocchio. Not right. What is his name? This is called Feast in the House of Levi, originally called The Last Supper, by Veronese. Thank you. I got a V in my head and I couldn't get it out. You had a little reading on this that I find hilarious, and it's meant to get to one big point. During the time period that Veronese is painting, the Protestant Reformation has occurred. The Catholics put into effect a stronger Inquisition. The Inquisition is basically the judicial arm of the Catholic Church, whose primary task is to judge whether something is religiously appropriate, right? Is this the right way to do this? And the Protestants, of course, one of the big things that comes out of the Protestant Reformation is a questioning of the propriety of various religious images. Hopefully you will have read about this, right? The Protestants come out and they say, wait a minute here, there's a couple of places in the Bible where it says, don't create idols, don't create graven images. It's not okay to represent God, for instance. According to the Christian Bible, it's absolutely not okay. And then it's questionable, I mean, you're representing God and Jesus and so forth without any clothes on. Is that appropriate? The Protestants raise all these questions about what is appropriate in religious imagery, and many people in Italy are worried about this. So when Veronese creates a picture that originally was called The Last Supper, and what he does is he just says, hey, man, this has been represented a million different times. I just want to have fun. And by the way, my job, Veronese's big job, was to create these beautiful architectural spaces to fill up a lot of space in rich people's homes. He said, I'm just going to reimagine the Last Supper. And I'm not going to focus really in on those things that typically are focused in on, like whether the betrayal happened in this way or that way, or what the Holy Communion is about. I'm just going to make it a big festive party. And he paints this, and he thinks he's off the hook, and then the Inquisition tribunal comes to him and says, hey, what's going on here? So I'll take you through some of these moments. Like he says, hey, what's Peter doing? Right? This is the Inquisition tribunal to Veronese, and he says, he's hungry, he's having some chicken. Right? And what they're looking for is, what's the significance of what he's doing? He's like, he's just hungry. Right? And then they go on, and they say, okay, well, what's the dude, is that Mark picking his teeth? What's that all about? It's like, well, he got some chicken in his teeth. I don't know what to tell you, man. I'm just imagining that it's a feast scene, and I just want to fill it with these characters, and then they get really angry, and they're like, what are dwarves doing at the Last Supper? And remember that part of the Bible. This is not appropriate. Why did you put dwarves in there? He's like, I just thought it was a rich person's home. They would have had entertainment. You know, I'm just imagining. I'm having fun. I'm being creative. I'm, being flamboyant, whatever. And then they go on to associate some of these characters with Germans, which, oh no, not Germans, because they're the Protestants, right? Are you Protestant sympathizer or what have you? In the end, and this was much more serious than that article makes it sound. In the end, he just said, screw it, man. I'm not going to call it the Last Supper then. We'll just call it Feast in the House of Levi. Are you guys all okay with that? And story's over. But what we get here is a creative, very, very kind of artistic, license-oriented representation of a scene that had really standard ways to represent it. How about this one? Let's turn this over to you, right? One of the things that we just had you do is a compare and contrast. This is a Mannerist work by Tintoretto, known as The Last Supper. And think of this work next to this work that you've already seen and thought about before, a work that will be one of the summary essay possibilities, The Last Supper by Leonardo. What's different about these two works, and what do those differences mean? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. Right, the whole point of the compare and contrast thing is just to allow you to see something you might not have others seen by juxtaposing different works and saying, oh yeah, that's right, that's different. I wonder what that means. And so in this one, let's start with this. Remember, you're always trying to kind of add up all the parts and get to the place where you say, here's what this is all about. Here's what the message of this is, or here's the way this artist is telling that story. And we said that the Last Supper oftentimes will focus on one of two things, either the betrayal or the communion. What do we see going on here, you think? Communion, right? It's mystical, it's odd. I mean, if you've ever pondered, and probably most of you haven't, but you think about this, at the Last Supper, he turns the bread into his body, the wine into his blood. What actually is happening there? Why is that happening? What is that all about? Does it really occur? This is playing with that idea, or this is representing that idea. So what contributes to that, right? What contributes to this being kind of mystical, much more oriented with spiritual concerns than everyday human concerns? How does the artist tell the story differently? Yeah? Okay, so what would you say about that light source? Is that a rational light source that we get from the Renaissance? No, it's a completely otherworldly light source. Suddenly all of the oil lamps start springing, very illuminated spirits from them as well, swirling through this space. What else? Help me out. I've been doing a lot of talking. Thanks, yeah. Excellent. So we have a lot more movement here, don't we? Starting with the swirling shapes up here, lots of diagonal lines of the radiating lights here, but also the fact that the entire composition is set up on a deep diagonal. Remember what we said about diagonals. They're going to imply movement, right? So we've got this deep diagonal, and yes, it still has a focal point, doesn't it? I mean, where do you look? Jesus, the most illuminated figure there, right? Head just boom with light. You're going to look at him. He's going to point you this way. Okay, so John the Evangelist is having some of this Eucharist. And then all the way down with these implied lines and all these hands moves us down here. Notice how down here you've got this sharp highlight on the leg and this leg that point us down here. Dog points this way, dog up here, up through the arm, up through here, all the way around, and again. So it does have its own organization, but it's not that strict, very stable organization of horizontal, vertical, or pyramidal forms. It's a nice big kind of oval with a huge diagonal in the middle. How about the lighting contrast? What does that do to people? It's very, very dark with very, very sharp light, right? Does that add a lot more energy to the work of art? Make you feel like something, religious is happening, maybe something mysterious happening? All of those are in play here, right? I'm going to skip that one. How about this one? If I were to say to you, let's start with this fun game. I know you like my games. Let's start with this one. I am absolutely sure, I'm a fellow member of your class, I'm absolutely sure that this is a lost Michelangelo work, or maybe a Leonardo. I'm sure of it. Absolutely sure. Disabuse me of this idea and tell me why you think this is a Mannerist work. Share your thoughts with your neighbor. How could this not possibly ever, no way, be a high Renaissance classical work of art? What are all the rules it's breaking? Turn to your neighbors to share your thoughts. So this is Jacopo Pontormo's The Entombment, although it's not entirely clear that it's an entombment, frankly. And what's one of the things that you notice here that doesn't look classical? Let you know you're probably looking at something Mannerist. Just give me one, yeah.
Expressive faces.
Okay, so we have a lot more emotion on these faces than we're used to, or at least in most of the Renaissance works. It's a weird kind of emotion, though, right? Does anyone look really distraught? They look kind of melodramatically sad, like an actor playing sad. You're going to see a big difference between this and when we get to Baroque period and you see really intense emotions. This is yeah, they're sad, but it's not quite clear how sad and so forth. But absolutely right. What else? Yep.
There's no rational place for them all to be.
Okay, let's talk about the space, right? Where are they standing? What's that person standing on exactly? Is that even a person? Where are they exactly? What is she standing on? He's standing on. What's this down here, right? All ambiguous space. And really ambiguous when it comes to the size diminution, right? Things that are further away get smaller. That's really small. How far away is she? Good. What else? Help me out. This isn't a tricky one. Yep.
There's a lot more movement going on.
Got a lot more movement. What's our composition here? It's a big, almost vortex, swirling around a kind of negative space in the middle, right? Everything going around in a big circle here. Does everyone see that? Does anyone need that pointed out, right? You can see this, everything swirling around this kind of central point here. How about those bodies? Are those bodies ideal? I mean, is that good proportions? I'm not sure what's going on with this body. Right? By the way, I call him Art Garfunkel. Does everyone know who Art Garfunkel is? He totally looks like Art. I don't know what's going on. How about this? What's his color? Why does he look like he has a sunburn here? What's going on there? Right? How about the colors themselves? You see a lot of these pastel kind of cotton candy colors in Michelangelo's career? There are actually a couple of moments, but I didn't show them to you. Yeah? So a bunch of things kind of odd about this. What is this sunburn going on? How about Christ's body? Does that look like an ideal body? Well, not exactly. But have you seen that body before? Oh, yeah, you have. Artist quoting earlier artists. That's the pietà. There is a punchline to this. Like, what is this all about? What's going on here? But I got to save it. I got to save it till next week. So, sorry. We're out of time. Right? We have 5 minutes? Oh, my clock's wrong. Okay, that's right. I'm just reading it wrong. Good. Then you can get it. Sorry. Let's go back to this. Here's the punchline to this whole thing. So it seems all esoteric. It seems weird. Doesn't seem like there's any explanation for what you're actually seeing. What is this color on this figure? Why these colors on these figures? What is the nature of this emotionality? Why is there a big empty spot in the middle? And the explanation is that originally when this painting was created, it was created in reference to another painting in the space that this was originally placed. And that other painting in the space was a big dome painting of God the Father reaching out to his flock, reaching out to all of us, to embrace us. And when Pontormo created this work, even though these days this is in a museum and you don't see it in reference to that, he was thinking of this work as basically dialoguing with this other painting by another artist, so that God is reaching out to this painting, in other words. And what we're actually witnessing here is less the entombment than the resurrection, or rather, the time in which Christ is sent back to heaven. And what is that time? We're right up on it. Easter. And where do you think we got all those Easter colors? They come from apocryphal tales that say when God embraced his Son to bring him back into heaven, he shone on the earth bright, vibrant Easter colors. And that's what you're witnessing here. So all of this kind of redness on these figures actually comes from those colors of God shining down. Yes, they're sad. Here's the Virgin Mary, but not really sad because Christ is being taken back into heaven. Right? And this empty space in the middle is once again about his departure from this world. So let's pause here then. This is a work by Parmigianino called Madonna the Long Neck. When we come back next time around, we will, on Monday, we'll finish up with Mannerism and move on to the next stage. On this one, remember what I was saying about the Mannerist period is that sometimes things seem really, really bizarre and then there's some explanation. So for instance, Pontormo's supposed entombment scene, which has all these cotton candy colors, is very ambiguous in terms of The emotionality that's being shown here has all these strange, setting things like what's going on, where are they supposed to be, why does this guy have a sunburn, and all of that. A lot of that is explained by a physical context in this case, that is no longer a part of this work, that this work was in relation to another fresco of God the Father reaching out, that it became more about God receiving his Son back to him on Easter with the Easter colors, rather than about a specific entombment, and that helps to explain some things. Also pointed out that, of course, these works are they're breaking away from a tried and true tradition of classicism, and they want to acknowledge that tradition is something that they're quite aware of, that they very much admire, but it's not going to be the thing that they're doing. And so when you see artists, and they'll do this all the time, quoting earlier masterpieces by grabbing basically the same composition of Christ's body here from Michelangelo, what they're doing, at least at a very basic level, is saying, I am totally aware of Michelangelo. I think he's awesome too. I'm just not doing that. I mean, it's like an author embedding a quote in their own writing to say, of course I love this author. I want to reference that, but I'm doing something a little bit different. And in this case, what they're also doing is saying, I'm showing you the next stage. Here's the lament of the mother for her son, and here's the son being received back by his father in heaven. Now, I'm turning this over to you again. This is a work by Parmigianino called The Madonna of the Long Neck, a really tough one to remember on midterm time, right? And yeah, if you've been wondering, how do they get these titles? The vast majority of the titles were made up by art historians or by collectors. It's not the artists going out there and saying, hey, let's call this one the Madonna with the long neck, right? It's usually people later on that look at it and say, oh, it's a Madonna, she's got a long neck. Well, let's call it that. Tell me why this is a Mannerist work. Turn to your nearest couple of neighbors. Check your way through the list of things. I mean, again, you can start with this. I think it's a good way to start. We set the ground with classical aesthetics. We said, here's what you expect in classical aesthetics. Here's why you expect it. Here's their aesthetic philosophy. Here's what's going on in the context. So that you have that foundation to say when something changes, okay, how does this look different than what I'm familiar with? Why does it look different? What changed in the context, and so forth? So turn to your neighbors and work your way through it. Why is this a good example of a Mannerist work of art? Okay, so help me out. Someone holler out one thing that makes this Mannerist. Or one thing that, it doesn't make it Mannerist, of course. One characteristic that is common in Mannerism that you see in this work. Yeah.
The baby's super unproportional.
Yeah. How many people think she should go check with her pediatrician really quick? Something's weird about this child. The proportionality is kind of weird. How many people think the baby looks a little bit sickly? Right? Doesn't look quite right? Well, there's a reason. Remember how I said that oftentimes in representations of Christ as a child, such as this kind of presentation scene, there will be something that indicates his eventual sacrifice or death. the Alpha Omega symbolism, right? Beginning of his life, end of his life. Christ says he is the Alpha, he is the Omega. It's related to the idea that God created all things and there will be an end of days judgment. All of that wrapped into this. So when you do this and you make that child, well, the proportionality is always going to be a little bit wonky because, frankly, children don't sit still for artists. And when you're representing Christ, he comes across as half man, half baby. But when you add this extra element of he looks a little sickly, or frankly, he looks like this, doesn't he? It's that same pose again. The Virgin Mary's proportionality, everyone notice that? Kind of weird. If she stands up, she looks like a giant bowling pin. And yet, where did we see that before? Right here, too. He's just exaggerating some of the features that were already in Michelangelo's work that weren't proportional, or at least they weren't proportional for a human body. They were very nicely proportional for creating a nice pyramidal form and a large lap for that child to be laying in. So going on from that, what else stands out? She's not proportional, but when I said formal beauty for its own sake, or beauty based upon the formal elements of art is a component of Mannerism, do people see in her what I mean by that? Can you look at her and say, this is a beautiful, long, sweeping curve, right? And a counter curve here and another curve here. This long neck, is quite graceful. The, elegant kind of shift here of the head here against the neck and so forth. The play of blues against whites. It's not a body that looks right for a body per se. Like if you saw a real human being like this, you'd think, wow, kind of odd looking. But as a work of art, since it isn't a real human being, can we manipulate those things to make it look visually pleasing? And that's the difference between a lot of classical works of art that are still premised upon the idea that this needs to look like a proportional human body, and other works of art that are like, no, it's not a body. We can stretch this, elongate it, make these beautiful curves, play with the textures of satins and so forth. That's pleasing as well. What else stands out here? Yeah.
There's an implied triangle from the top of her head down to the baby's feet and then all the way over.
Good.
It's like referencing back to classicism.
Yeah, we still have this pyramidal form. It's just up here. It gets a little bit asymmetrical down there, but that actually points us to this figure here, right? So everyone see that? Big pyramidal form here. Then we get a bunch of ambiguities, don't we? I mean, where is this set? What's going on? Who's this little dude over here? Is he little or is he a million miles away and so size diminution has made him small? What's he doing? Reading a scroll? How does that fit in? Who are all these characters over here? Does anyone have any hints for me? Who are these characters over here? So the trick is, how many of you are having a pretty tough time assessing, figuring out what their gender is? They either look like really pretty boys by standards or androgynous looking characters one way or another. And what did we say about those? Angels. Even if they don't have wings, angels. Little diminutive, somewhat androgynous when it comes to their sexuality, it's not, or their sexual characteristics. It's not entirely clear. Tends to be angels. So we have angels. Why would they be in there? To make sure we know the heaven part. This is, Christ comes from heaven. Christ is the Holy Spirit made man and so forth. And they carry with them this vase. That vase, if we were to look at ancient Greek art as well, you might start associating that with funeral vases. Funerals were used a lot of time as vessels for basically tomb markers. That would be another part of the Alpha Omega. But the more important thing is that a vase or a vase is something that is associated with Aristotle again. In this case, Aristotle once said that women's contribution to childbirth was as if they were a flower pot into which the man planted his seed. And yes, you can all groan, ladies, but that's what he said. A very passive relationship in which the man's active seed is planted into the woman, and then over the course of the gestation period, she functions a bit like a flower pot or an incubator for that seed. Now, in every other situation, that might be true, or might not be true, but in this situation with the Virgin Mary, she is a vessel. She's the vessel by which God makes himself man. So there's this little nod to that through this fairly esoteric symbolism. Over here, when a guy's reading a scroll, you got to think old times because the scroll part of this, and then you've got to think, well, he's associated with these classical columns too. Probably what you're looking at is a prophet foretelling the coming of Christ, right? So remember that Christians look back at the Old Testament. They look back at old writings by non-Christian societies. We saw this on the Sistine Chapel ceiling with all those sibyls, those oracles. And they say, this was a prophecy to tell of the coming of Christ. And in this case, this odd juxtaposition between this character who's pushed way back in the background or made very much smaller and where all of this is set might actually be a juxtaposition between two moments in time. We're looking at a present moment, a presentation scene, and then a kind of shooting back into the past of a prophecy that foretold of this coming. The other weirdness about these columns that just end is that the painting is not entirely finished. All of this red here is actually the ground against which white would be placed to create more of this monument, and it hasn't been finished here. Finally, there's a couple of things I want to point out. The Virgin Mary oftentimes will show some indication of her humanity. In this case, the belly button that's very clearly shown through this satin kind of cloth is on purpose. This is to let you know she's human, that she was born of man, right? And when you see, as you see all the time, Christ's genitalia, I mean the most genitalia of any character ever shown in the history of art will be Christ as a baby. The reason for that is always, and if you look back over the works that I've shown you, you'll see this, is to show that he's human, that he was born of God, but he is man. As they said, born of man. Right? So think of how far we've come. There are things that are similar about these, but there are a whole host of things that are different about these as well. So there are a couple of works that I'm going to go through fairly quickly here. Anything that I go through quickly in class, it's not likely to, well, it's not going to show up on a midterm or a final, but the ideas that I talk about in front of these works should be taken and applied to other bigger works that we spend more time on. So here we're looking at a work by Bronzino. It's a portrait of Ugolino Martelli, who was an Italian scholar, what's known as a literati. And a literati is basically an amateur scholar, something that people of the upper classes might do in their life because they don't need money. They just devote their lives to scholarship, who lived in Florence. And again, with portraits, what I always want you to think is, what does this guy want to tell you about himself? When he sits down with the artist and he says, here's who I am, this is what I want to tell the world about myself, what is he saying to the world? What does he want to represent about himself? And we've seen at least one woman represent herself, Isabella d'Este, right? And what did she want to show? I'm beautiful, I'm fashionable, I'm rich. What does this guy want to show you? Yep. He's a scholar, and how do you know that by looking at this? Got some books with him, right? And one is Homer. One is Homer, and one is Virgil, who is a more contemporary writer. These are both classical authors. So he's saying, I'm not just a scholar, I like the classics. And he's wearing that clothing, that dark clothing with that hat. Those are associated with scholarship, right? It looks a little bit, you can kind of be reminded of this when you think of graduation regalia and all that ridiculousness that goes along with people who have higher degrees wearing weird hats and various shawls and all that. That's based upon this precedent. Then, what's behind him? Okay, a statue. What is that a statue of? David, excellent. So you see a severed head at the foot of a young man, pretty sure that's David. Then let's take it one step further. Maybe he just likes David. Maybe it's his family's patron saint. Could be in some cases. It's his name saint. It's not here. We know his first name's Ugolino. But let's go beyond that. What do we know that David's associated with in terms of cities that we've seen so far? Remember who he's the patron saint for? Which city? Florence. Excellent. Michelangelo's David, made for that. So could be, and it is in this case, that we're in Florence. The other thing I'm thinking about, though, is that architectural setting. That's his family's house. So he's also showing you he's got some serious wealth as well. Now think about the difference between that and what we saw in a woman representing herself. And also, always remember this. They're not making this up based upon their own, ideas about themselves entirely. These are always premised upon what they think will play well in their society. They're always reflections of what is esteemed in their society. And those things that are esteemed oftentimes are quite gendered. Women are expected to be this is what we esteem about women. Men are expected to be this is what we esteem about them. Men act, he's the scholar, women appear. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I think it absolutely should not be this way. But that's the way it was, and it's very clearly represented in their art. Bronzino's most famous work is this bizarro work. And there are a million different interpretations of this out there, by the way. It was something that I flirted with a little bit as one of your research papers, but I dreaded what I would have to read if I turned this over to you. It's a work that's usually referred to as Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time. And sometimes you see it referred, as your text says, as the Allegory of Venus. So the trick here is figuring out, I think, who all these figures represent and what their personifications are, right? What they're all about. It's filled with symbolism. We believe that Bronzino was commissioned to create this work so that it could be sent as a present to the French king. It's not entirely clear whether this was a little tongue-in-cheek and meant to be funny and meant to be a kind of joke between two rich men or not. Certainly some of that's in there. But I just want to take you through these characters real quick and then see if you can put together what the moral message of this strange work is. So right in the center, prominently displayed, is Venus. You always will know it's Venus if she holds in her hand that golden apple. The story of Venus, for those of you who don't know, is important. The way that this story goes is that there's a huge feast among all the gods for a wedding, and everyone had been invited to this feast except for one goddess. This is oftentimes the case in Greek myths. They set you up for this. So the goddess that they didn't invite this time was the goddess of Strife, right? So let's not invite her. She's no fun anyway. She doesn't get invited. She's mad about this, so she decides to create strife. And what she does is she gets a golden apple, probably a golden apple from the Garden of the Hesperides, and she has inscribed upon it the words, "To the fairest," or "To the most beautiful." And yes, again, if you're wondering where we get all of our fairy tales, we rip them off and clean them up from Greek myths. In this case, she takes that apple, she rolls it into the banquet table, all of the goddesses erupt. They're like, "I'm the most beautiful, I'm the most beautiful," right? It finally resolves down to the three big ones: Athena, Aphrodite, also known as Venus, and Hera, who is the wife of Zeus. And they go to Zeus and they say, "Hey Zeus, you're the king god, tell us, who is the most beautiful?" And for all of his failings, Zeus gets that this is a no-win situation. Number one, there's three of them. He's going to make two enemies. Number two, one of those enemies is likely going to be his wife, who we've already established is not all that happy with Zeus most of the time anyway. So what he does is he says, I can't decide. I'm going to give this over to Paris. Paris is a young prince of Troy, sends these goddesses down to him, and he'll make the decision. But we'll save that because that's going to be a work that's coming up next later on called The Judgment of Paris. So you see that apple, oftentimes with a woman who doesn't have any clothes on, going to think Venus here. Okay, Venus, what does she represent? Well, traditionally in Western art, she represents beauty. We've established that. You can show her nude because it's all about beauty, and we've gone through our interpretations of the female nude. However, traditionally in Greek society, Aphrodite represents sex, kind of messy sexuality. If Aphrodite wants to get anything done, she just seduces people, right? No one can withstand her charms here. And that's in this. That's going to be a part of this work associated with sexuality. Cupid over here, the way to know that you're looking at Cupid, yes, he's got wings most of the time. Cupid's not always just a little fat, blindfolded cherub figure. In Greek society, Eros, as he's known, is a beautiful youth. And so he's kind of more like that here. And he's got these arrows or darts. Those darts are there to inflame sexual desire. They're not about love. They're about kind of lustiness. And what's happened here is that she's taken that arrow away from him. That's a standard symbol of being chaste or trying to hold off your sexual desire. We go up here at the top. This is really important. This older guy here, so old, bald head next to an hourglass, is Father Time. And over here, you see a figure that is actually axially on a diagonal aligned with these masks down here. So think of masks and appearances and falsehoods. And if you looked at her really carefully, you can see this especially around the ear. She doesn't look like a real human being. She looks like someone who's wearing a mask. So think dissimulation or fraud or something that's false. Down here, the young man, the boy, with flowers in his hand is associated with folly. Young kids, if you don't know this already, don't have a lick of self-sense. They just do whatever they want. In this case, the flowers in his hand have to do with the folly of love. Remember how we said that flowers are associated with sex or love? And he's just throwing these around, right, indiscriminately. Behind him, at first you just see a pretty face, and then you see what this is attached to. This is a chimera figure, Chimera. Chimera just means part human, part animal, oftentimes multiple animals. And she's associated with pleasure. So she's part woman, part, it looks like snake here, and probably some lion's claws as well. Anytime you see a chimera in the West, that's going to be danger. That's going to be monstrous. This is something that is unnatural. In just about every other society, they're powerful figures. But in the West, they're monstrous. So she is associated with pleasure because what she has in her hand is a honeycomb. And honeycombs have been used forever to be associated with sensual pleasure, the richness, the sweetness of honey, and lots of metaphors about sex in there as well. So then you start seeing some other things. This pillow down here, that's a courtesan's pillow. Don't ask me why. I don't want to get into it today this early in the morning, but I'm sure you can all piece it together. And then over here, these masks, again, fraud. Obviously, most of you know that Cupid and Venus, or Aphrodite and Eros, they're related, right? Eros is the son of Aphrodite, or Cupid is the son of Venus here. So they shouldn't be doing this unless, of course, this is a Game of Thrones picture again, which is getting really weird because no one's gone, oh my God, John, you shouldn't. Anyway. So right off, you've got an alert. Whoa, what's going on here? What is this all about? What am I supposed to see? I want to see what you get out of this. You've got all these characters. What do you think the moral message of this work is? Turn to your neighbors and for about a minute, just share your thoughts on how does all this add up? You got anything for me? How about this one? What's time doing? It's actually pulling this curtain away to show deception or fraud here. So time is revealing the fraud or folly, sexual pleasure, basically. It's one of those, you're caught up in it, you're caught up in desire, caught up in sex, you're, excited about whatever. You're just going to, it's a powerful force, right? You're going to get caught up in it. And what this is saying is, think about the next morning where you're like, oh my God, what was I thinking? I'm not saying any of you have ever been there before. At some point in your life you might be there, I don't know. That's what it's getting at. Time will reveal the folly, or time will reveal the deception of the pleasures and folly of earthly love, of indiscriminate love, supposedly. Then we have this character over here. See that person screaming their head off? For a long time, people just thought, oh, that's probably just like, oh, what was I thinking? No, it turns out that if you look at that character close enough, there are some lesions on their skin that might be associated with advanced syphilis. Syphilis was a really fun thing back in the day. A lot of people died of it in horrible ways, and they went insane. It actually attacks the brain at the end of their life. And that's probably in there to say, if you're frequenting a lot of prostitutes, if you're just in it for sex, you might end up in this state. And that's one of the more recent interpretations of this. All of that being said, though, what is this really about? What does it kind of push in your face more than anything else? What allows it to be about this, like, oh, this is not good? This beautiful body, right? This little butt shot over here, too, by the way, of Cupid. All of that is what is the big pleasure. It's a double articulation again, right? It's saying those two things at once that seem to be in conflict. Don't do this because something might go wrong. But on the other hand, it's showing you over and over again, look at this. This is the thing you really shouldn't do. So we're going to go quickly again through a couple of these works. Another really interesting thing that happens during the Mannerist period is that we start to see more and more, in their own right, women artists. Women have been in the workshops of male artists forever. In the background of Tintoretto's workshop output was his daughter Maria Robusti, and when she died, his output just went into the toilet. So they've always been there. They just didn't get a lot of play. No one mentioned them because it was thought that great artists were all men. And if you want to command higher prices for your work, you don't say, for instance, hey, by the way, my daughter works in my workshop and she's 20 times better than me, and you should get her work rather than mine. It just doesn't work that way. But in the Mannerist period, with the opening up of larger commissions, these women go off on their own in their own right. This is a work by Sofinispa Anguisola, who we would have a lot more to say in this class had not about 80 of her portraits burned in a fire in one of the palaces in Spain. She was Italian. She came up in a very humanist family. She was taught artistry when her father sent her off to be apprenticed to a master artist. By the way, women didn't want to be in these, in most cases, women artists were the daughters or relatives of master male artists. And you wouldn't send your daughter off to go to an artist studio and learn things because it wasn't really a very safe place. I mean, we have lots of evidence of sexual assaults occurring. These aren't really above board places. So in her case, it's pretty exceptional that she becomes an artist at all. What you're looking at is a work that's called The Sisters of the Artist and Their Governess. It's mainly a way that she can show you that she can paint really excellent portraits. It's all of her sisters and the governess over here playing a game of chess in which the older sister is making a bonehead move that is finally going to result in the middle sister winning a game for a change. And so it's got a little bit of sibling rivalry. It's got, of course, great portraits, frontal portraits, profile portraits, three-quarter view portraits, right? She's just trying to show off for you. This is another, well, actually, I'm going to move through this to Lavinia Fontana's work. Lavinia Fontana was the daughter of a master artist, went on to have a fairly productive career in Mannerism, and this is her version of the Annunciation. She painted oftentimes little miniatures on copper. There are a couple of different reasons to be painting on metal. One is that the surface deals with the paint quite differently, but also these are they're little miniatures that copper doesn't buckle very much, and the light goes through the oil painting and actually glows off the copper in a very cool way. They don't last as long. That's why the surface looks so bad. When I blow this up to, it's at least 100 times the size of the original work of art. What I like to do with this one, though, is to say, and it's not entirely appropriate, frankly, but it is a good kind of question to ask to start you thinking. How does a woman deal with the subject of the Annunciation versus a man deal with this scene? So with the Annunciation of Leonardo da Vinci, how does he deal with it? How does Lavinia Fontana? Now, I say it's not entirely appropriate because there are a heck of a lot more factors that go into the reasoning behind why an artist makes choices that they do, the context that they're in, what the patron wanted, and all of those things have to be thought of as well. But it is also the case that artists do add something, obviously, to the work. And so if you just take this as a thought experiment, how are these different and how might they reflect gender differences, right? So over here, first of all, as I said before, imagine that an angel shows up in your bedroom and it's like, hey, by the way, are you ready? Christ is, God's going to send Christ through you. And you're just like, no problem, got it. That strikes me as something that is totally in line with the Christian gospel, makes a lot of sense, but it is also something that doesn't show any empathy for what it might be to be a 14-year-old woman, right? Over here, on the other hand, in this Annunciation scene, she's obviously just stood up, dropped her book on the ground, bowing her head, kind of ready for it. It seems to me, and including the look on Gabriel's face, who is like, are you sure you're ready? He looks like he actually shows a little bit of emotion here. Maybe that has something to do with a woman saying, what would it be like? What was I like at 14? What would it feel like to be in this position in a way that a man just really isn't thinking? Again, just as a thought experiment. El Greco, sometimes associated with Mannerism. I think he's just his own animal. El Greco is the name of this artist that just literally means the Greek. His real name is Theotokopoulos, who came from Crete, in Greece, who grew up as an icon painter, who then moved to Venice for a brief time and then through Rome to work in Spain for the Spanish court. And his most famous work is this one called The Burial of Count Orgaz. Now, obviously, if you were to look at this and I were to say this is a lost Raphael, you should be able to say no way at all. It doesn't look like that at all. And we'll get to that in a minute. The bigger thing that I want to talk about here is that this is a massive work that was a huge commission for Count Orgaz, who had died a couple of centuries before. He was a benefactor to the church. And when the family had enough money, and in relation to a donation that was happening in the church that this was created for, they hired El Greco to create a kind of historical remembrance of this great man with all of the contemporaries in their own society as portraits here below witnessing his burial. So it includes, for instance, things in the scene that never would work. They're not chronological, they're not logical, including St. Augustine and St. Stephen, who weren't alive at the same time, and neither were alive during the time of Count Orgaz here, coming to help bury him in the ground, right? So all of this is portraiture of the people in the time. Count Orgaz here, and probably El Greco's son here, included in a kind of little cameo. To jump ahead, though, the thing that's really interesting about this is down here below, everything is ordered, everything is rational. We have a rough pyramidal form here in the center with Count Orgaz in the middle. All looks very solid, understandable, and then you get up here and it just gets typical El Greco. El Greco painted very elongated forms. He paints in a way in which things look like they're made insubstantial, they're diaphanous, they're translucent, as if you can see through them. Oftentimes cloud-like forms compete for the same space as figures around them, making you wonder where we are, and more often than not, everything is full of energy in his work. So here we are up in heaven. I'm actually going to get us in closer if I can. And so up in heaven, take me through it. Who do I have here? St. Peter, because of the keys, right? Older man, keys, got his iconography. Right-hand side of Jesus as God up in heaven now. Who's that? Virgin Mary, blue and red, blue representing heavenly status, red her passion, her love, and her pain. Over here, John the Baptist. Remember, hair, lots of furs. So John the Baptist over here, various angels on each side, various of the elect, probably other prophets, angels up here, souls everywhere, these figures that are kind of insubstantial, as if they're fading in and out of the cloud-like shapes, other characters that I'm not going to go for. But one of the most interesting things of this whole work for me is this. This is the angel who is taking this soul of Count Orgaz and sending it up to heaven. And look at this shape here. At this time, and starting in the Renaissance, of course, they had been doing anatomy lessons. They have been dissecting bodies for a long time. One of the most famous of the anatomists is a man that you'll get to know well, especially if you pick the Rembrandt option of your directed research paper. He worked in Spain under the directorship of Charles V, the major Spanish Habsburg king. His name was Andreas Vesalius, and he made this beautiful tome full of etchings of all of these dissections, showing you the different body parts, labeling them, and so forth. And when you look at this, those of you who have recently taken biology or something, that's very clearly a birth canal to me, right? This is basically a reverse birth here. We've got basically a vaginal form through which this figure is being reborn in heaven. In other words, they're being influenced by the knowledges that they're gaining as humanists. As collecting these knowledges, it makes perfect sense to say that soul's reborn into heaven, and it looks like, let's say, a kind of cloud-like shape, but clearly like a birth canal. More El Greco here, right? El Greco's types of crucifixions, very elongated, very spiritual, all very mystical works. And then I want to turn this one over to you to just practice your formal analysis. On the right-hand side is Felix Hortensio Parravicino, and on the right is Cardinal Guevara. These are both portraits by El Greco. How are they different? In other words, how does he get to a sense of who these characters are? What makes you feel like these are different types of characters? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. So which guy do you guys want to go have coffee with? Which one seems like the more sympathetic character? I'm just going to point. You raise your hand. Him? Yep. How many are like, no, that dude? No. If I were to tell you this guy was the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Catholic Church, would you be like, okay, that makes a lot of sense? This is the judicial arm. If you've never heard about the Spanish Inquisition, not someone you want to be brought in front of. Unlike the Veronese tribunal where they're like, oh, no big deal, just change the title of the work. Spanish Inquisition would oftentimes burn people at the stake, make them crawl through glass, all kinds of horrible things. So this guy was a monk, a friend of El Greco's, who he actually taught painting to, among other things. What makes him seem more sympathetic than the work on the left? Just give me one thing. Okay, let's start with the colors. What are those colors? Over here. So what's that? That's a kind of brickish red, and then next to this we've got, go ahead, this isn't a tricky one. brown, and then more brown, kind of offish white, more brown. What is that color combination then? Analogous or complementary? Analogous, mainly analogous with a couple of kind of contrasts of white here, but everything bleeding together. And is red a warm or a cool color? Warm. So expands towards us, feels embracing. Look at his pose. Very open, right? Open to his body, unguarded, really relaxed. Hands are relaxed, facial expression looks relaxed, looks back out at us, so forth. Then we get over here, and even though you would say, oh, red, that's a warm color, can everyone see that there's blacks and blues in that red? So they compete with each other. That's going to make that red look even more intense. It's going to animate it, give it more dynamism, more movement. And accompanied with that, all around this, all of this brocade in here, all of this decoration behind him, it's agitated. It's supposed to seem full of energy. Then we go beyond this and look at his look. Does that not look sinister? I mean, he might be the nicest guy in the world. Who knows? Unfortunately, he doesn't look like the nicest guy in the world. And looking from behind those spectacles, it's like, oh, I'm not sure what's going on here. Then look at this, the way he clenches this end of the arm of the chair, filled with tension, little cues in here, meant to make you think this is not a guy to be messed with, as is probably what he wanted El Greco to show of him. Any questions?